everybody, what's going on? Today we're going to go over the TM-2 module settings. In this video, I'm actually going to tell you my settings, and I'm going to go over how to fix miss triggers and double triggers. I'm also going to show you how to upload your own samples to the TM-2. This is a great module. I use it with the Roland triggers, Ddrum triggers. I've used it with the E-kits. It works with everything, and I've never had any issues, but the trick is to learn how to use it properly. First thing I suggest is reading the manual and read it again. Try and learn what these settings do and go through it while I'm explaining this to you, because it's going to help you in the future. Copying somebody else's settings is the wrong thing to do, even though I'm going to give them to you anyways, because my drums are different than yours. They're set up different, and if you move your drums and put them back together and something's not working at a show, you need to know how to fix it. If you have any questions on this stuff, put your questions below. I'll do my best to answer them. I also do requests for other video lessons if you want to ask below. Also like and subscribe, and it keeps me making these videos more often. Alright, so this video is going to be mostly just talking. I'm not actually going to be playing in a lot of it. I'm just going to be showing you on the module what settings do which. I'd say about 99% of the time, if you're missing hits, that is caused by a settings issue, which we're going to go over. There's a couple things that can cause that. Or in a rare case, you're just hitting way too light. Most of the time, we can eliminate that with some of the settings. Big common issue a lot of guys have is double triggering. Before you start diving into, thinking about settings and everything, why is it double triggering? There's about 3 reasons. First one is your settings are wrong. Second one is your bass drum is not set up right, or whatever drum you're trying to trigger. If you have it very loose and no blankets or anything in there, when you hit your snare and it's setting it off, it's probably because there's extra vibrations going. That can be a combination of the settings or why your drum is set up wrong. I suggest for anyone starting out, fill your drum full of blankets or pillows or whatever, and actually tighten the head up a little bit, and then once you learn how to do this properly, you can start removing stuff later on. I just don't suggest learning on something that's going to be already difficult to set up. Another thing that can cause double triggers is technique. If your left beater is resting on the drum, well, if every time you hit the drum and it's bouncing up and hitting it again from the vibration like a double bounce on a trampoline, and it triggers, that's not actually the module's fault. That's not a double trigger. That's your technique wrong. You need to keep that left beater off of there or adjust your settings so it can rest without coming back and hitting again. I've seen people have problems with the Axis E-kits for the same reason, saying, oh, it's double triggering. Well, no, you're actually hitting the hammer into the thing, and that's what it's supposed to do, so it's working perfectly. Another thing is if you have really tight springs, when you hit the drum, if you back off a little bit, or if it kind of, triple bounces off the head, like, I can't really do it right now, but that's going to cause double triggering as well. Once again, you're actually hitting the drum. It's working as designed. Alright, so first thing we do is shift insert, then we hit the plus to get into there. You're going to set up a pad or a head and rim trigger. So the next time you go to the right, you can select what kind of trigger it is. So you got all the Roland ones in here because it's a Roland module, but you can select the pads, the RT30K. I have the 30K. Next is your sensitivity and threshold. I just changed that, so these would have gotten changed here. Normally, my sensitivity I have set around in the upper, probably 20 to 25. I don't use dynamics on my bass drum. So that changes for each person depending on how hard they hit, if they want dynamics, and if you have blankets, etc. in your drum. If you have it too sensitive, when you start hitting your snare and stuff like that, it's going to be setting off your trigger, which we counteract that with the threshold. Next is the threshold. Mine's usually around 15. That's the minimum hit to set off the trigger. So if you're just, tapping the drum like this and it's triggering, your threshold is way too low. You should have to hit the drum to make it trigger, or you're going to have double triggers a lot of the time. I see guys with their beaters this close away from the drum, so their sensitivity's maxed out and their threshold's really low, but then they're getting mad when they, hit their snare really hard in a rim shot and they're wondering why their bass drum's triggering. Well, because the vibrations from your snare drum hit are harder than you've actually hit the drum there. Last, curve. This is where you set up the dynamics. Linear, is same for same. The log is actually more dynamic, so if you're hitting light, it's going to be lighter. I usually have mine set to loud too. That is the least dynamics this module will give you. Retrig cancel. This is the distance between 2 hits. So if you're getting miss hits, often I'll see guys have this thing set to 12 plus, and if you play fast, you're going to be missing hits, especially when you're doing heel toe and stuff like that at fast tempos. I usually have this set to around 2. If you are noticing double triggers, I slowly increase this, maybe 3, maybe 4, and I keep playing, and I'll go until I start missing, and then I kind of keep it in the middle. I find at even 3 or 4 at the speeds I play, I don't really seem to have any issues with it, but it's just one thing to keep in mind. Crosstalk, everyone is asking what everyone's crosstalk is. Unless you're using multiple inputs, it doesn't matter. That happens when you have, say, 2 trigger pads and you hit both at the same time. Or if you hit one and the other one's triggering from the vibration, this will cancel it between that. So if it's sensing something in the trigger 1 input, it won't be triggering number 2. As you go through, there is the system menu where you can adjust the contrast, brightness, type of battery. The output gain is another important setting. I have mine set to +2. If you notice, the only complaint I have in this module is when you adjust the volume, the headphone and the output volume changes at the same time, which is a pain for shows. Because I often want my in-ears louder, but if I want it backed off or something like that for my kick drum sample, that's why I got this second mixer here, because I can't touch this or the front of house guy is going to get angry. What I did was I set the output gain a little higher too, because this thing actually has a fairly weak output signal. Make sure you back this thing up. You can back it up to the card inside. That's very important. And if you are going to be putting your own samples on here, when you get your memory card, stick it in here and run an SD card format. After you do that, you got to take your sample. It has to be a WAV file, and it also has to be 16-bit and 44.1 kilohertz. So you can use Reaper, Pro Tools, whatever. When you render the file, only render it as long as it needs to be, and make sure you use those settings. If it's a WAV 44K 16-bit file, it will play on here. Otherwise, you're going to get unsupported format. It's got to be pretty specific, but after you format this, it creates a bunch of folders on the SD card, and it's pretty obvious. If you hit instrument, that gets into the drum that you're using. I'm using my Fear Factory sample, but you may have your own bass drum sample or be using one off of the module. When you hit right, you can see this is the volume. They're not all set to 100. You want that at 100, otherwise if you notice you have, say, 2 triggers or one's louder than the other or anything like that, or it's not full volume, change that to 100. Dynamics, this is where you can actually set the single trigger. I set that to max. Loud 2, loud 3, it's close, but I don't want dynamics in my kick drum, so it's in 2 spots. I set it to max and loud 2 in the other one just to make sure. Pitch, you can adjust the pitch up and down. I pan it center. You don't want to loop it or it's going to keep playing it over and over. So if you're having double triggers, the first thing you need to do is go into your bass drum, put in some blankets and tighten it. Having a ported drum will help a lot for this too, because you don't want that head vibrating more than it needs to. If you're still having double triggers, look at your pedals. Chances are either the left pedal or the right pedal is actually bouncing off the head more than once. If you have a cell phone, put it down there and videotape yourself playing for a while and use the PA so you can hear when it's double triggering. And I bet you're going to notice that the bass drum beater is hitting the head more than once. It's so common. Guys will fight it and say, nope, my technique's fine, that's not the issue, and then they look and it is. Last, I would go shift insert, go into your trigger setup, and the next 2 settings you need to check are your sensitivity. If you're double triggering, lower it a bit. Threshold, turn it up. Eventually, this is going to cause it to miss if your threshold is too high, unless you are crushing the hits really hard. So that basically is, if you hit lighter, you got to play that lower, but then make sure your drums are all relative. If you're hitting your snare drum as hard as you can and tapping your bass drum, it's going to be difficult to set up. That's where moving your trigger to the right side of your drum or something like that is going to help. And the retrig cancel is another one. That is one way if you do rest your bass drum beater and it's bouncing, because those hits are so close together, sometimes you can turn that up a bit and get away with it. The slower you play, the easier it is to turn this thing up and not have it miss any hits and get rid of double triggering. If you're really fast, you gotta have this lower, you gotta have everything dialed in just a little bit more. So that's how I set mine up. Those are basically how I have my settings. My sensitivity is usually around between 20 and 24, I would say, for the most part, and my threshold is somewhere between, I would say, 13 and 16 most of the time. I'll move it up or down 1 or 2, but those are the 2 I play with. Everything else just works. I'm using the RT30K trigger right now. Works amazing, and I have a ton of blankets in there, and my bass drum is tight. I also have the new Axis triggers, the E-kits, or the E3 triggers. They work really well. I'm just playing with a few things before I make them my full-time triggers. So yeah, if you subscribe to this and keep watching, I'm going to post more videos on those soon. I just have a few things I want to tweak to make them perfect for me. And other than that, like this video. If you got any requests below for other lessons or questions on triggers, feel free to ask me and I'll do my best to answer them.